Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, and welcome to the symposium SP42 Take-Home Messages for Active Case Finding Learning from TB Prevalence Surveys, TB or not TB. My name is Evelyn Klinkenberg. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and I have been providing technical assistance to countries preparing and implementing TB prevalence surveys. My co-chair for the session is Petra de Haas, a senior laboratory consultant at KNCV, Tuberculosis Foundation, and also GLI member. And she has been providing also technical assistance for the conduct of TB prevalence surveys to countries focusing on lab quality assurance. As we all know, results from TB prevalence surveys using both expert and culture raised queries on defining TB due to unexpected discordant results. As surveys are key to provide insights in the country TB epidemic, it is important there's a good understanding of what we call TB. And some of you might have seen, and otherwise I recommend looking it back, the session in TB science around subclinical TB, which also is relevant for the discussion we might have later after the presentations. During last year's union meeting in Hyderabad, we had a lively session discussing how these discordant findings can be interpreted and what we call TB or not. In this symposium, we will discuss key lessons from recently completed surveys in this perspective, and also the capacity of the diagnostic methods used in surveys, as well as the latest global guidance for the conduct of these surveys around this discussion. The concluding presentation will provide take-home messages of the use of these results for active case finding. So today we will have 5 speakers. The first presenter is Dr. Bobby Sismandis, a scientist from WHO Geneva, who will talk about how results from recent surveys have been used to update the guidance from the Global Task Force on TB Impact Measurements on the screening and diagnostic algorithms of these surveys. The second speaker is David Gabriel Macheke, Laboratory Coordinator of the first Mozambique National TB Prevalence Survey of the Ministry of Health and the National TB Control Program in Mozambique. And he will talk in his presentation about the key lessons learned from doing culture and expert for all participants in their national survey. The third speaker will be myself, and I will talk about strategies to minimize culture in TB prevalence surveys, lessons from targeted culture testing in the TREATS project. The fourth speaker will be Dr. Kathleen England, a laboratory expert who will take a deep dive with us into the diagnostics and will explain current issues with diagnosis and the reliability of current methods while providing guidance to clinicians for decision-making on case management. The fifth and last speaker will be Dr. Helen Ailes. She's a professor of infectious disease and international health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a member of the guideline committee for the screening guidelines, and she will talk about the insights the prevalence surveys have provided in the diagnostics of TB and what lessons can be learned for active case finding efforts. At the end, we will have about 25 minutes for live Q&A, and I encourage you to all post your questions in the platform in the questions chat. There's a general chat for general comments, and the questions is the chat with the 2 double speech bubbles. I think by now we all are familiar with this. So if you can post them there, we can publish them and have the speakers answer these at the end. So now I'm very pleased to give the floor to Dr. Bobby Sismandis for the first presentation. Thank you.
Good morning to all, and many thanks to the organizers of this symposium for the opportunity to present on how results from recent national TB prevalence surveys are being used to update the guidance from the WHO Global Task Force on TB Impact Measurement on the recommended screening and diagnostic algorithms for these surveys. I will be providing some background, presenting some results, and finally, the draft guidance and associated recommendations. I have no conflict of interest to declare. Since its establishment in 2006, the WHO Global Task Force on TB Impact Measurement defined national TB prevalence surveys as one of its strategic areas of work, as a way to improve the availability of national robust data and inform active TB disease burden estimates in countries with weak TB surveillance systems. Between 2007 and 2016, 25 surveys were implemented in 24 countries. An additional 8 surveys were completed between 2017 and 19 including repeat surveys in Myanmar and Vietnam, and the first surveys in Eswatini, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, Nepal, and South Africa. India started its first ever national survey in 2019. By the end of 2019, only 2 of the original global focus countries, Mali and Sierra Leone, had not implemented the survey. The reference standard for the diagnosis of active pulmonary TB disease is culture of Mycobacterium tuberculosis from sputum samples. However, in most countries with a high burden of TB, sputum smear microscopy was the most commonly used diagnostic test for TB in 2007. Therefore, testing of sputum samples using both smear microscopy and culture to diagnose TB was the method recommended for national TB prevalence surveys in the global guidance known as the Line Book that was published in 2011. The screening and diagnostic algorithm recommended in the Line Book consisted of screening all eligible individuals in the general population using a questionnaire about TB-related symptoms and a chest X-ray, followed by diagnostic testing for all screen-positive individuals using smear microscopy and culture, with 2 specimens tested in each case. Nonetheless, one of the major challenges faced in surveys implemented between 2007 and 2016 was the performance of and capacity for culture. The arrival of expert that was easier to use than culture and better in performance compared to smear was much welcomed by the TB prevalence survey subgroup of the TB impact measurement. This led to a growing interest in the use of rapid molecular tests in the context of surveys. Initially, the expert MTB RIF assay, endorsed by WHO at the end of 2010, and subsequently the expert ultra assay, evaluated by WHO and endorsed in 2017. Expert MTB RIF was initially, between 2011 and 2014, used only for the confirmation of smear positive specimens. In 2015 and 16, Bangladesh, Kenya, and the Philippines were the first 3 countries to systematically use expert MTB RIF as well as culture to test all participants that screened positive. They were followed by Vietnam in 2017. Surveys implemented in 2018 and 2019 in Lesotho, South Africa, and Myanmar used expert ultra in parallel with culture for all participants that screened positive. A challenge in all these surveys implemented since 2015 has been the discordance between culture and expert results within the same individual. While discordance is to be expected given the lower sensitivity and specificity of expert compared to culture, as well as the possibility of false negative and false positive culture results, of course, it creates difficulties on how to interpret and use discordant results. We talked about the logistical advantages expert assays have compared with culture, but both expert assays also have disadvantages. In particular, they have lower sensitivity and specificity. Results from the find evaluations are shown here. The best estimate of sensitivity was 83% for expert MTB RIF, 88% for expert ultra. These findings mean that if expert alone is used to test samples from survey participants that meet survey screening criteria, true cases of TB will be missed. That would not have been missed if we were doing culture. The best estimate of specificity was 98% for expert MTB RIF and 95% for expert ultra. The main explanation for the false positive expert results is that expert detects dead TB bacilli or fragments of DNA, whereas a culture positive result requires live TB bacilli to be present. Evidence about the sensitivity and specificity of the expert MTB RIF assay compared with culture in the context of a TB prevalence survey is summarized on this slide. In studies that used multiple expert tests on separate samples, only the first test result was used for the analysis. We're showing here results for specificity that were consistent with those from the find evaluations, while sensitivity was lower. The estimated pooled sensitivity of expert MTB RIF compared with culture was 73%, while the estimated pooled specificity was 98%. The lower sensitivity of expert in the context of a prevalence survey can be explained by the fact that a greater proportion of smear negative pulmonary cases are identified in these surveys compared with the clinical settings that were studied in the find evaluations. True TB prevalence among screen-positive survey participants is between 2 and 7%, a lower level compared to clinical settings. Using find evaluation data, this translates to between 1 to 2/3 of expert positive results would be expected to be false positive results in the context of a national TB prevalence survey. Let's look at an example. If true prevalence is 2%, among 1,000 people, there will be 20 TB cases. Assuming 70% sensitivity, about 14 out of 20 cases will be correctly identified by expert. Assuming 98% specificity, an additional 20 cases will be incorrectly identified by expert. The 34 positive expert cases are upward adjusted to correct for sensitivity to give a total of 45 positive expert results. Therefore, if expert results are expected at face value, the estimated prevalence will be more than double its true value. This is an unacceptable level of error when the main objective of the survey is to reliably measure the level of bacteriologically confirmed TB disease in the community. Now, where are national TB prevalence surveys relevant post-2020? There are two categories of countries. The first category is among countries that have already completed a prevalence survey between 2007 and 2020. Among those, we look at bacteriological epidemiological levels of TB that are high enough in the first survey, and we're also looking for a time period to elapse between the first and second survey. We also have a second category of countries that did not implement the national TB prevalence survey between 2007 and 2020. So among those, we look at countries that have high enough level of TB burden, that they have no reliable measure of TB disease burden, and that they have low access to quality of health services. And there are 21 such countries that have been identified currently. So the recognized microbiological reference standards test for diagnosis of pulmonary TB is culture. For this reason, culture is also the reference standard test that is used in the context of national TB prevalence surveys. Nonetheless, it is challenging to ensure high quality culture testing in the context of these surveys. And while this has generated growing interest in the use of expert assays, since they're easier to use in a reproducible way, these tests also have important limitations. So if expert results are taken at face value in the context of a survey, the burden of pulmonary TB could be substantially overestimated. With those challenges in mind, we're presenting three main options for diagnostic algorithms for future surveys. The first option is essentially the one that just uses culture results. The second option is the one that starts with expert results and confirms positive expert results using culture results. And the third option is a hybrid option that splits the surveys into two strata. One stratum follows option one, and the second stratum follows option two. And this third option is only relevant for countries that are planning to do a repeat prevalence survey. Now, the major objective of a national TB prevalence survey is to obtain a reliable estimate of the burden of TB disease in the country. Recommendations for the diagnostic algorithms to use in future national TB prevalence surveys need to ensure that this objective can be achieved. We are summarizing in this table draft recommendations that will be discussed further with the TB Impact Measurement Task Force. The table first distinguishes two categories of country. The first column, those that completed a survey until 2020 and those that did not implement a survey until now, but which do meet the epidemiological criteria to consider doing so in the future. In the next row, the table defines the three culture testing strategies that are used in surveys implemented in 2007 and 2020. And it then asks the question of whether culture testing for all screen positive individuals is currently considered feasible, if it is possible to do it or not. For each of those combinations of country category, culture testing strategy, and whether culture testing of all screen positive individuals is feasible, one or more of these three options for diagnostic algorithm that I presented in my previous slide is recommended. And I would just like to close my presentation by acknowledging the National TB Program's survey teams and survey participants of all survey teams, including the TRITS TB study group, the subgroup on TB prevalence surveys of the WHO Global Task Force on TB Impact Measurement, and of course our funding partners, our main funding partners, USAID and the Global Fund. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone attending to this conference. I have no conflict of interest to report. My presentation will talk about gene expert and culture for all in the Mozambique National TB Prevalence Survey, ensuring quality of the lab procedure, dealing with and addressing discordant results. Mozambique is amongst the countries most affected by tuberculosis in the world, like the rest of Southern African countries, largely attributed to the socio-economic challenge as well as the relatively high HIV prevalence. The country's first TB prevalence surveys aimed to determine the prevalence of bacteriological confirmed TB within the adult population and to estimate the prevalence in the general population. The sample size defined for this survey was 42,700 persons aged 15 years and above in all 72 selected clusters. There were 3 field operational teams, 1 in South, 1 in Centre, and 1 in North. Each team had 1 truck equipped with 2 gene expert machines and 1 chest X-ray facility, and 1 central team located in the NT area. All participants screened as positive by symptom or by chest X-ray were eligible for sputum by the automatic algorithm, and all were requested to provide 2 to 3 samples. All collected samples were tested by experts in the field and culture at the end with discordant field expert and central lab culture. Result further testing was done, amongst which subculture on MG. For all eligible participants for sputum was requested to provide 2 spot samples. The spot sample 1 was tested in the field level by gene expert, and in case of positive result or error or invalid or no result, participant was requested to provide the third sample in the next day for expert repeat. For the spot sample 2, after collection, this was stored in the fridge and later was packed. Inside the cool box was included also thermometer and dog tag for temperature monitor. At the NTRL level, all the samples were received and the batch temperature information were recorded in the database. All the received samples were decontaminated using 2% of sodium hydroxide and acetyl L-cysteine method and incubated at 35 to 37 degrees and weekly readed for 8 weeks. The positive sample were submitted to identification test, and for MTB positive culture were tested for resistant by genotype MTB DRS plus and further DST. In case of invalid or contaminated culture, the sample were submitted to the expert using storage pellet sample. For the negative culture, while in the expert was positive, this was considered as discordant, and the storage sample underwent subculture on MG. Related to the survey quality assurance, at the field level, field testing at the same day was done for the expert, and the transmission of the result by GX Alert to the data management solution used to this survey. Storage of S2 sample in the refrigerator to keep to 2 to 8 degrees till collection by the carrier. The inclusion of the thermometer and log tag for temperature monitoring. While in the central level, electronic database for capture of all performed tests was used, and record of sample batch reception, temperature, thermometer and log tag temperature in the database. The use of positive and negative control at the low level in the culture testing batches, and the validation of all performed tests at the NTRL by highly trained staff. Also, the monitoring of the survey result and the use of Bartek MIG 906 two subculture, all discordant result. For sample transportation duration, about 10,018 samples were put on transport to the NT area, and 59% arrived within 2 days, while 37.3 arrived between 3 to 5 days. Most of the samples arriving between 3 to 5 days were from rural areas and in center region of the country. Using log tech, we have been able to monitor the temperature along the transportation. In this graph, we can see that even the sample that arrives in the same day we still see maple recording highest temperature. This pattern was similar within the sample arriving between 1 to 5 days. The long transportation duration and highest temperature recorded could be related to the geographic location of the districts that in the majority are located in areas with difficult access. Related to the temperature variation along sample transportation, the graph shows that the temperature is rising along transportation. This was related to the non-replacing of the ice pack during the transport by the carrier, as they are not trained and allowed to open the cool box. In this graph, the temperature average in majority of the sample transported was above the recommended range, which is 2 to 8 degrees, and remained higher till arrived to the NT area. Related to the summary of TBPS result of laboratory, in 72 class listed about 70,114 people. Those was eligible and invited to participate about 43,442, and was full screen in this survey almost 99%, and was eligible for sputum about 10,187. For those eligible for sputum, about 99.1% provided S1 sample, and these about 99.3% was tested for expert, and 0.9 was positive. For those who provided S2 sample, this about 10,016 sample was 16 sample was transported to the NTRL, and 98, which correspond to 98%. Those samples were submitted for the culture, and about 90% of the sample culture was negative, and 1.3% was positive. For those that was positive, about 108 was ZN positive, and only 29 was M tuberculosis detected. With smear microscopy, about 0.5% was positive, and 96.9 was negative. To those with contamination, with contaminated result of 5.6 or 5.9%, those was submitted to the gene expert using S2 pellet, and invalid also for those that was not done at the field level. By gene expert, 92 samples were MTB detected, while by culture only 29 were MTB detected. For discordant culture submitted, or for discordant culture submitted for subculture, about 40 samples tested positive for MTB, improving the quality of the culture. Combining LJ and MG culture result, about 65 were MTB detected, and 50 were positive in both culture and expert. For the positive control, about 81.96% were positive, while 1.46% were negative. This could probably be due to the technical mistake or quality of control. But for all that was negative control, all the batch was tested as negative. And this shows the good quality of the lab testing. In conclusion, experts detected more TB case compared to the culture. The discord between the culture and expert was more common among low bacteriological load on gene expert. Transportation time and temperature may have affected culture positivity rate. The Bartek midget 906 improved the sensitivity of the culture and it added more value on reducing discordant result. The log tag have shown the variation of the temperature during the sample transportation, and the use of positive and negative control have shown the quality of the lab testing. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. Just for administrative purposes, I have no conflict of interest to declare. This talk will be about strategies to minimize culture in TB prevalence surveys, lessons from targeted culture testing in the TREATS project, and I will be presenting on behalf of the TREATS study team. This is the same slide, so I'm just going to skip it. A little bit of the background. Also in the last union meeting, we had a symposium around the observations around discordant expert and cultural results in TB prevalence surveys, and that has been an ongoing discussion since. And also last year we had a very lively discussion around this topic, and therefore this year, as part of this presentation, is part of symposium looking at what we have learned in the last year around this issue. And it's very important to get a better understanding about this discordance, to measure and understand it in the context of screening in the general population in the community. And I think important lessons for active case finding can also be learned, but also for other survey work. We all know that doing culture in TB prevalence service is challenging. It often disturbs the routine needs of culture in a country. Most countries have limited culture capacity, especially for this large number of samples that are being processed in terms of TBPS. And it's really difficult, it turns out, to really do quality assured culture on a large scale, especially with this typical TB prevalence survey sample. So we set out to try and answer a main question of, can we limit or minimize culture in the TB prevalence surveys? And this was done as part of the TREATS project, and TREATS stands for Tuberculosis Reduction Through Expanded Antiretroviral Treatment and Screening. And it basically evaluates the TB outcomes of the POPAR trials in 21 sites in Zambia and South Africa. And as part of this project, because we needed to know what algorithm we needed to apply to answer our main aim, to which I will come in a second, we conducted a so-called intense diagnostic phase, which we called IDP, to determine the optimal algorithm for TBPS for the TREATS project itself, but also learn important lessons for TB prevalence surveys and active case finding. Sorry for that. So the overall aim of the TREATS project is to measure the impact of this combined TB-HIV intervention, as outlined on the slide. The original TREATS TBPS algorithm was very simple, and we designed it specifically like that. And we had the plan to only collect one sample and conduct expert MTB rift. But by the time we wanted to start, there was this important discussions going on around this discordant result that were observed. And we felt we can't not just move ahead with the original design. And therefore, we decided to try and answer in this so-called IDP phase several specific questions. In this presentation, I will focus on questions around how many experts should be done, and do we still have to do culture, and can we minimize culture? So the algorithm is as follows. On the first day, all participants are screened as in most surveys. Then sputum eligible participant based on symptoms and chest X-ray have two samples collected, both spots S1 and S2, and they are processed by a gene expert in the field. And we also collected several other indicators that are presented in other presentations in this symposium, for example, around CRP. Then on day 2, which is specific for this survey, we asked all sputum eligible people to return to the survey site, and we collected another sample called S3. And also they were seen by the medical officer who reviewed their chest X-ray and also made necessary referrals depending on the findings of the chest X-ray and the first two sputum samples. Then if we move to the results of the IDP phase, the key findings that we had were that were around sensitivity of doing 1 or 2 samples, so the ones that I will present here on 1 or 2 samples, and also around the culture expert concordance. So this table outlines sensitivity of doing 1 or 2 samples, testing them with expert ultra compared with a third sample which was culture positive. So for this table, only those who have a culture positive result on the third sample collected are included. So as you can see, both overall in both countries, the sensitivity was clearly higher if we just did one as one only, or we did as one and as two. And this was true for both countries. And also we see some differences in by HIV status, history of TB, and whether or not symptoms were reported. This table outlines concordance between expert and culture results by grade of the expert, and it's organized that those with the highest expert grade are on the top, and the lower you go, the lower the expert grade becomes. And as you can see, the positive predictive value reduces with when the level of expert detection goes down, and especially in samples with low, very low, and trace calls for expert, we see a big variation of a big discordance and not all are culture positive anymore. And the negative predictive value for those where both samples are negative is very high. So using these results, we concluded that 2 expert tests increased the sensitivity, and the gain increased when trace is considered positive, and there are differences by country and related to HIV status and reporting of symptoms. Discordance between expert and culture result is associated with expert grading and history of TB treatment. And it's mainly seen when expert grading is trace very low and low. And more often when there is a history of previous TB treatment. So we use these results to come to an algorithm for the rest of the survey. And basically, we had to do that on the initial findings, and what we did to reduce culture is outlined in this slide. So we instead of the originally planned 1, we now decided to take 2 samples for expert testing from all participants, and then based on the results of these 2, we decided on further testing. So if in both samples no MTB was detected, we concluded these were not TB cases and we didn't do further testing. If the samples were detected at a level of very low and above, with at least 1 at low, we considered them TB cases, and for all other samples we collected 2 samples for culture S3 and S4 and processed these. Then doing that, we see that the number of individuals tested with culture significantly reduced by about 95%. And in the table, the findings for IDP and non-IDP to date are outlined. With, as you can see, about nearly 2,000 samples were collected for culture in the IDP, while only with the current algorithm, we would have to collect only 62. And also what is important to point is the last column, where you can see that in the IDP, we managed to collect about 3/4 of the culture samples that we wanted to collect, and this increased in the non-IDP as we could focus more attention on this group. So in summary, we conclude that culture is not needed for all individuals to decide on whether it's TB or not TB in a TBPS and ACF setting. If moving forward, but we can't change the outcome in our trial, but for others we would advise to consider further improving the algorithm shown by expanding doing culture also for those who reported a history of TB or from whom HEAL TB is or can be observed from the chest X-ray, and for all those with low, low, and low, very low expert grade levels. This will reduce the number of cultures and allows then more focus on an investment in transportation and better quality assurance. And if culture is done, 2 samples should be cultured under good QA for a TBPS setting, which mostly has very low bacilli load in the samples. And that means that we could restrict cultures to just about 8% of doing all. And these are the rest of the TREATS team that I want to acknowledge for their contribution. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Kathleen England, and I'm here today to unplug diagnostics and share the working realities that can affect accuracy and performance of testing. I have no conflict of interest. Over the years, we have seen discrepancies between diagnostic tests in prevalence surveys, research, and even routine patient diagnosis. The TREATS project here illustrates a significant level of discordance between expert versus culture, also noted in many of the recent prevalence surveys. The key is to ask the question why. We know some of these reasons. For expert positive and culture negative, expert factors deal with detection of dead bacilli, detection of non-cultural bacilli, and detection of cell-free DNA. There are many factors that can affect culture positivity, specifically low or paucibacillary samples. For expert negative and culture positive, we also have rational reasons. If the sample has bacilli lower than the detection limit, it will not be detected. And we also know that expert is MTB specific and that it will not detect mycobacterium other than TB, which culture can grow. So we must ask ourselves and understand that these two tests ask different questions, providing different results. The expert MTB Ultra asks, is the MTB genome present? And culture methods ask, are culturable TB cells present? Both of these assays and methods have features that are important for patient diagnosis, but they also have limitations along with external factors that can affect their accuracy. For example, specimen transport factors, factors that challenge the quality of culture, can relate to temperature. High temperatures increase contamination rates and can suppress or reduce mycobacterium growth. It can also induce a stress response that will put the bacteria in a dormancy state. Delays deplete oxygen within the sample, which can increase the growth of aerobic microbes and fast-growing flora that compete for nutrients. MTB is an obligate aerobe, and it needs oxygen to replicate. Low oxygen can induce a dormancy state of the bacilli that's a survival state, which can be harder to cultivate. Oral flora can compete for growth. Salivary enzymes can digest or lyse microbes, and leakage can happen that can risk contamination. We also must understand that sample processing and culture preparation is a very complex, multi-step process with lots of procedural manipulations that risk human error, contamination events, and increase the loss of cells. Improper sodium hydroxide preparation can make the pH too alkaline, which also can kill MTB bacilli. Not liquefying the sample thoroughly prevents the release of cells from the mucin complex. A decontamination step greater than 20 minutes can damage or kill MTB bacilli. Centrifugation, or at temperatures greater than 8, can kill MTB bacteria, and often this process has leakage, which can lead to sample loss. The midget inoculum, if it's greater than a half a mil, will increase the pH and lead to a false positive result, and also can increase the growth of contamination that like and prefer that pH. Accurate midget media preparation is important for including the Panta concentration and the addition of supplement, which can affect growth. We know that Panta also has some inhibitory effects on mycobacteria. Incorrect temperatures and power outages, or long temperature periods where the temperature is not at the correct, will delay and stop MTB growth. And we also know that the culture methods we use today are not selective only for TB, but grow mycobacteria. Recently, studies have demonstrated a significant loss, nearly a log reduction, of viable bacilli during culture processing. Here, methods using MBLA, solid, and midget culture were assessed to determine the extent of that loss. In midget, not only the stringent sodium hydroxide decontamination step in blue arrows, but even the temperatures during processing, orange arrows, can contribute to cell loss and cell viability. Thus, expert positives that are very low in trace are naturally going to be culture negative. Further, midget recovery depends on many factors: sensitivity and selection per species, with MTB being the best selected with the high sensitivity. Cell number. Samples with a low burden of cells will take longer to time to positivity, as shown in these two studies. The time to positivity of the system is limited to 42 days, providing false negatives for strains that need more time to grow. In this study in South Africa, they observed accidentally that some cultures grew past the 42-day threshold by leaving the samples over a weekend or holiday. Assessing 21,000 cultures, 8% of the cultures grew accidentally past the 42-day threshold, raising the question, are we missing infections? Further, site of infection for extrapulmonary specimens can affect the bacterial metabolic state, which can have a delay and affect the recovery of the culture conditions. Recent studies using NGS or sequencing methods have determined that there's a loss of genetic diversity due to culture selection. Sequencing on direct sputum samples versus its paired culture isolate provide more representative description of diversity within a lung infection. Culture selects genetic versions of the bacilli that are more fastidious or better able to grow in the culture media and are not representative of the complete population within the sample. Also, molecular methods may test and may detect viable but not cultural bacteria. Further, and finally, we must understand that TB has innate characteristics. Patients can have different lung pathologies. Their lesions can be calcified, caseous, or necrotic. And these have various microenvironments for the MTB bacilli to survive. So when a patient expectorates in a cup, the bacilli found in the sputum cup can have different metabolic states. Some that are active and can replicate and will grow in culture, and some that are non-replicating and will not grow in culture or not be viable. Further, studies have shown that these two states can exist in the same sample. These studies were dealing with cultures that were set at high oxygen levels and transition to low oxygen levels to demonstrate these two states. Active metabolizing cells take up stain that when metabolized fluoresce green. Non-replicating or low metabolic cells bind the red stain to the cell surface molecules, illustrating in the same sample that these two states can exist. Further, MTB, Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria, produce molecules that still stimulate or resuscitate growth called resuscitation protein factors. Sputum bacilli not able to grow in 7H9 culture can be induced to grow when culture filtrate from an active growing culture is added, illustrating that MTB can regulate its own growth for survival. Finally, we know that there are various growth rates between lineages, strains, drug susceptible, drug resistant strains, and that Mycobacterium has very selected conditions for growth. So in summary, molecular and culture-based tests are not equivalent. Transportation time conditions are critical to ensure specimen quality. Culture processing is complicated with a high risk of error and inaccuracy. Low burden samples detected by molecular methods often lose detection by culture. Midget recovery rates vary, depend on various factors, and may not detect all strains within the 42-day prescribed limit. Culture methods are selective for best growers under defined conditions. Mycobacterium tuberculosis has unique states and traits that impact growth and culturability. Direct sputum testing is more representative of a lung infection. And molecular testing of sputum provides the best detection for MTB or Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but does not reflect the metabolic state or viability. So in conclusion, we must remember that diagnostics are imperfect. If we ask, is MTB present, the use of a direct sputum rapid molecular test is best. If we ask, is there an active infection, then we need a method better than culture to assess paucibacillary samples that we find in prevalence surveys and now that are being detected by expert MTB-RIF Ultra. I hope now that we share a better understanding of the nature of MTB, various factors that affect culture, and the compounding elements that can affect the accuracy of the test results. Thank you.
Hello, So I'm Helen Ailes, and I'd just like to inform you that I do have conflicts of interest to disclose, which are on the screen in front of you. So today I'm going to talk about what we can learn from prevalence surveys for active case finding for tuberculosis. We're all trying to end TB, and we know that if we are going to end TB, we need to find every person who is affected with TB and get them engaged in adequate treatment and cure. And to do that, we need to actively find individuals with TB and really understand how best we can do that. Prevalence surveys can help us in this, because currently there is very limited evidence of the best way of finding cases of TB, and also very limited evidence of how best to use the tools to find individuals. So the first issue that we face is knowing who to screen. Which groups are we missing in our current strategies of finding people living with TB? Well, prevalence surveys can really help us here, because they can identify individuals who have been missed by conventional means of finding TB. Prevalence surveys actually diagnose undiagnosed TB. And so everybody who we find in a prevalence survey could be considered to be somebody who has not been found yet by the conventional case finding system. Now, of course, many of those would be found, but some may not. And so by looking at the data from prevalence surveys, it can really help us with targeting. Prevalence surveys are, though, designed to give a representative sample of a whole population, and so may not be best for subpopulations. But I think in almost all prevalence surveys, we identify more men, and so that gives us a clue that men may not be presenting so readily to traditional health services to get diagnosed. And also, prevalence surveys can give information on groups at highest risk. This is some data from one of the prevalence surveys we conducted a few years ago. And you can see that on the graph on the left, the open circles represent Zambian communities, and the closed circles represent South African communities. And what the graph shows is the prevalence of tuberculosis. Each of those little dots represents a community. And on the x-axis is the proportion of people who had previous TB. And you can see a very clear separation between the Zambian communities and the South African communities, where the South African communities have a much higher number of people with previous TB and a much higher prevalence of TB in the prevalence survey. The graph on the right shows by individuals in each of those communities, those who were treatment experienced and the prevalence in that population, shown by the black dots, and the prevalence in the treatment naive population in the open dots. And you can see a striking difference. So people with previous TB are somehow being missed. Why they're being missed, we don't yet know. Is it because they don't recognize the symptoms, or is it because they've not been told that they could have TB again, and so therefore they don't present when they have similar symptoms? We can also understand how to screen. Should we do something like a molecular test like Expert for everybody, or can we triage using symptoms or chest x-ray or something else? So if we are thinking about doing sputum from everybody, rapid molecular testing opens up this possibility. The ACT3 trial, recently published from Vietnam, showed a decrease of 44% of TB at population level following annual screening with Expert for All over 3 years. But it's interesting to note that actually in each round, only between 35 and 45% of the population could provide sputum. And in this study, those samples that were positive on Expert were cultured for TB, and only between 52 and 75% could ever be cultured. And this will ring bells from some of the previous talks we've had in this session, which really shows us that Expert and culture are measuring different things. Again, of the Expert positive samples, chest x-ray confirmation was not 100%. It was between 66 and 70% of those individuals with a positive Expert appeared to have TB on chest x-ray. This study also gives us some interesting insight into how you could reduce the number of tests done by pooling of samples. But even so, the number needed to screen in this scenario to prevent one case was over 1,000 individuals. So how do we interpret this? Well, active case finding works. It can reduce tuberculosis, and even if only half the population are providing sputum. And it may be considered that those individuals who are most likely to be symptomatic, most likely to have TB, are those most likely to be able to produce sputum. It also tells us something about this dichotomy between people being positive by TB culture and X-ray and with molecular testing. And I think we have to reflect over whether we mind that these are clearly measuring different things, but then what do we do with the results? How do we manage somebody who has a positive expert result? Do they need treatment or do they not? And it also tells us something about the cost and feasibility. But could we make it easier and simpler? So what about symptom screening? I think prevalence surveys have taught us a lot. They've taught us that symptom screening alone is unlikely to identify most cases of prevalent TB. But we all know that it's easy to do, it's feasible. And maybe those individuals with symptoms are the most likely to be spreading tuberculosis in a population, and so maybe the best target for active case finding. But we also have to understand why it is that symptom screening doesn't identify all individuals. Is it that there is truly asymptomatic TB, or is it about the perception of symptoms and who and how the asking is done? So in HPTN 071, the pop art trial, we were doing door-to-door screening of a whole population, doing universal testing and treatment for HIV and TB. And in the EDCTP funded TREAT study, we're investigating the effects of this on TB. We did an annual symptom screen using very simple 4 symptoms for the entire population, and only took sputum from those who were symptomatic and tested using smear for HIV negatives and expert for HIV positives. We then did a prevalence survey in the same site. So this is just in 2 of our communities, just to give you an example. And you can see that in the first year and the second year, the percentage of the population who were symptomatic was only 1.4%, of whom between 6 and 8% were found to have TB. We were worried about this, and we felt maybe people weren't asking the questions well enough, or maybe weren't probing deeply enough. And so we retrained and reevaluated. And in the 3rd round of the study, we managed to find 3% who were symptomatic. But you can see that the percentage of those who actually had TB dropped. And so actually the number of people found with TB was about the same. So the yield halved. Now in the prevalence survey, in the same populations, asking a broader symptoms screen, we found that 4.6% were symptomatic. Again, a lower proportion of those had TB, but we did find more cases of TB overall. So can we improve on symptom screening? This again is work that looks to try to combine symptoms with other risk factors, but shows that really, even doing this, the area under the curve is not ideal. What about chest x-rays? Chest x-ray screening has been done extensively in prevalence surveys and has been made much easier when we move from analog to digital chest x-ray and using artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence systems have been developed, and this recent review compares 3 of the most available systems, which shows actually very good performance, as good as a human reader. And this strategy could reduce the number of molecular tests by 50% or 75% even, by altering the threshold without a significant loss in sensitivity. It's less easy to assess how this would work in case finding from the prevalence surveys, where we generally use chest x-ray as part of our algorithm. And of course, the cost of setting up x-ray is large, but unit costs are small. But how easy this and feasible this is to do in practice, it will vary depending on the setting. But are there other tests? C-reactive protein, or CRP, has been proposed as a screening test for TB. And how could this be integrated? An abstract being presented in this conference by Maria Ruperez shows some evidence from our prevalence surveys, which look like by combining symptoms with CRP, we can increase the sensitivity as high as 85% in HIV positives. So in summary, prevalence surveys can guide us in who to target for active case finding, and also can give us some clues as to how to do it best. But we need to still do more work to analyze combinations of screening tools to maximize the yield while minimizing the costs and complexity. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to thank my collaborators from the TREATS Consortium, which is funded by the EDCTP. And you can see here some of the teams that I'm working with in providing some of the data that I've shown you. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. So I want to open the floor now for the discussion. I think we had some very wonderful presentations, clearly showing the challenges between expert and culture. I would like to give the floor to Babis to maybe first start answering some of his questions that appeared in the chat.
All right, thank you very much, Petra, and thank you to everyone for the great questions. It's always a pleasure to be part of discussions of people who are involved and interested in prevalence surveys. I'm sorry you cannot see me. I've been having trouble connecting to my camera, but it's lovely to see so many friendly faces part of this symposium this morning. All right, so first off, I think a lot of the comments have actually been excellent. To my mind, the first main discussion point is what is really the objective of a prevalence survey. And typically the way that we have been using them so far is as a tool to inform burden estimates for what we call active TB disease. And this is in countries that have problematic case notification and surveillance systems. So they're essentially our only way to measure correctly, in quote unquote, active TB disease in the country. And they're not necessarily tools that we use, such as active case finding, where we're essentially going out in the community to try and find as many cases as possible. I mean, you have to remember that we're sampling anything between 50 to 100,000 individuals to find only about 103 or 400 cases. So really the primary objective is not to find as many cases as possible and treat them correctly, but it is to inform as accurately as possible burden estimates. So really that is the objective that we have been using. That is why culture has been so important to us, because what we've seen, and of course expert is simpler, and it definitely seems to be the future, there's no question about that, but really taking expert results at face value worries us, and it worries us when we see results from all these surveys, because we are likely to overtreat and we are likely to overestimate significantly if we're just using expert results from the field. That is why we feel that there needs to be a combination of expert and culture for surveys moving forward, or we still think that there is a good case to make for countries that have cultural capacity to continue using culture. The problem, so just to, I think I've answered some of the questions on the chat, but just to Luis Cuevas, hi Luis, who's commented about the example I gave on the false positives. It's true, it was it was overly simplified, just in the interest of time. We have actually estimated propagated uncertainty and really looked at that. So there is a much more detailed assessment that's been done. I'll be more than happy to share those with you. But in the interest of time, I try to oversimplify it. But really, the message is that there's definitely concern about overestimation. The other point, yeah. So okay, perhaps I'll stop here and give others a chance to talk.
Thanks, Babis, indeed. And I understand very much your concern about the overestimation. And as you know, we also have the concern of underestimating by using the culture methodology, as we have also shown in the presentation. And I think this is indeed a very important debate between these different methods. And so I don't know whether Helen or Kathleen would like to respond to this, because I think we need to also look into the false negative cultures, as shown by Kathleen, how much we could miss doing that, and especially when you go around the cutoff values of both of those tests. So maybe, Helen, would you like to first discuss more, and maybe you have some questions you would like to answer also through this platform.
Yes, thank you very much, Petra, and thanks to all the speakers. I think Kathleen gave us a really brilliant presentation, just really laying out all the problems of culture, and that's what worries me. And I think there's also, a question, well, a comment really in the chat from Arnie van Delft about, what it means for somebody to have a positive expert, because that's the dilemma I think that we face in the field when we're doing prevalence surveys. We have individuals in front of us who have a positive expert test, and we need to know how to what to say to that participant and how to make sure they get the best care. And for me, if somebody is expert positive and they've got an abnormal chest x-ray or symptoms, which is what we find, then I find it very, very difficult to say this person does not have TB, because I believe they do have TB. And so I'm quite passionate that often it's culture that is falsely negative, because we all know, if you've ever done a prevalence survey, it's really hard to do culture in this number from the field, transporting it for miles to reference labs that are then overwhelmed with trying to do culture. So, I tend to be slightly more in favor of using expert than I know maybe my great friend Babis is, because I'm really interested in the people that we're finding and really making sure we get the best treatment for those people. I just wanted to answer one question from Lewis, I think I saw, which was about symptom screening. Again, hi, Lewis. I do think symptom screening often gets a bad reputation, because we do find a lot of people with no symptoms or minimal symptoms who in prevalence surveys have been shown to have TB. But really, symptom screening, it's all about who is asking the question and how the questions are being asked. And that was what I was trying to show from the pop-art data. We had people who were really focused on HIV case finding, and we found that they really didn't ask the questions very well, because they were much more focused on HIV and making sure everybody got tested and referred into care. And so the TB screening, I think, can end up being done very quickly, and people don't... And so it's not that people aren't giving you the right answers or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But I think it's us who are asking the questions. Maybe don't always ask well enough. We don't probe. And so I do think symptom screening also still has a place, because I think it's easy to do. It can be done anywhere by anyone, but we just need really good training to make sure it's done well. So that was maybe all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Helen. I thought maybe we can now go to David, and because I saw, David, you had a question around also the repeat of samples. So when you had a culture negative and an expert positive, you did repeat those samples again, and then you had culture positivity. Is there anything you would like to say about that? And I see many questions for you around the positivity rate, so maybe you can say something more on that. David, are you able to, because we don't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
I think I was muted. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was saying that it's a pleasure for me to be here in this very important discussion about the culture. How can we address all this issue that we have been facing? And all the presentation that we saw today was very, very important, because it showed us what was the challenge. I thought the challenge that we had in our prevalence survey was only about something that maybe happened to the Mozambique, but after the presentation of another speaker, I saw that that is not something that only happened for us. It is a challenge that we have, because we cannot control after we have the sample, and then we have to transport to another place. So everything will happen to the sample. So what we're going to do, how can we decide if we are giving the right result for that? So it is a big challenge. And then in way to try in our prevalence to have at least a very good confidence on how to decide the good result should be provide for this case. And we decide to repeat all those samples that had negative culture by solid media, because we know the limitation of the solid media. It's not so sensitive as a liquid medium. And in fact, that was shown in the result, because when we subculture those samples using a medium, we had a lot of the sample that was negative by solid media, and then in the liquid media they was positive, and we have been able to recover the mycobacterium tuberculosis. So those results, I think we should try in the next approach to see how can midget can be introduced, even if we are applying for the solid media as a principal method for the survey, because we know that our liquid media, principally in the country that have more difficult on the transportation issues, we can have a lot of contamination, then we can have a lot of problem. But in this case, as we have selected specifically those samples that was a negative in the culture, and then we put them on the midget, we didn't have that. So we had very good recovery rate using a midget. I'm not sure if I did correctly answer the question, but that was our experience related to the repeating those culture by midget. If there is another question, please.
I was muted. So thanks, David, for the clear answer indeed. And I think next to the algorithm to define whether we do expert or culture, it's also important then to, when we do culture, is how we're going to do the culture indeed. That's what you finally present clearly here, is that there are a lot of other things that needs to be then also written down and much more defined across the country, so that we can really compare things with each other. I don't know, is there any other question that we would like to raise here? Maybe I need to give the floor a little bit to Kathleen, who had a wonderful presentation about how culture can be challenging as well. And we both know, as we've been working in such a lab for a long time, how challenging it can be. Is there anything you would like to express again about the false negative culture, Kathleen, that we really need to bring forward in this case, especially around when you're working with samples around the cutoff point, as we have in prevalence surveys?
Yeah, I do also feel that there has to be some quality steps and quality measures in the process of when you're doing these culture at any time, but especially in prevalence surveys, because of what all those challenges we face of getting a specimen from the site to the testing lab to have a good quality performance of the tests that we're doing. So maybe quality checks along the way, which I think was discussed in the last year's talk. But I also want to stress that with the Expert Ultra, we're picking up all, some low detection of bacilli, genetic pieces of bacilli. And as we know, we still don't know about whether this is indication of actual disease or not. And I think the issue is, somebody raised this question about, is it early stages or subclinical or incipient or early development or chronic disease that will spew bacilli out of a lesion or something at one point and then not at another. So there's a lot of things going on with the patient or the individual. If they have TB, there's a lot of questions with both of these tests. So I do think we need to have something better than culture to assess viability, especially in this process, because there's so many delays and so many reasons to have errors. Over.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kathleen. I do see a question here from Martin saying that is there anything else that we would like to measure? Because we are measuring to be or not to be, but is there also something that you want to measure, like trends? I don't know if there's anyone of you who would like to respond to that, maybe Babis or Helen. I don't know if you've seen the question.
Yeah, I'm happy to give that a go. Just I think it's really wonderful to to be discussing with people with so many different disciplines, because I think, you know, I'm a statistician, and I think about things, you know, this is data, and basically I mean, not as cutthroat as that, but you know what I mean. So I think about using the data from this prevalence surveys to really understand burden at one point in a country, and then when we do carry out repeat surveys in a country, to really try and estimate which way the burden in the country is going down. So I think it's important to remember. So obviously there's a lot of discussions within the lab experts, there's a lot of discussions within the program people who are interested about finding as many cases as possible and carrying out active case finding. But, you know, from the point of view of using these prevalence surveys to basically inform burden estimates that allow us to say whether countries or regions or the world progresses well towards reaching the targets with the NTB strategy, you have to understand that if we start introducing, if we change completely the algorithm of prevalence surveys compared to how we've been doing them now, and how we would like to be doing them, if we really move away with it and just do expert, there's going to be major issues with the estimation process. And I think this isn't a perspective that I would like people to be aware of. So the decision is not just about active case finding. It's not just about programmatic management. It's not just about finding more cases. It is about also how can we make sense of the data to really understand as clearly as possible which way the burden goes in the countries, and whether we are managing to reach targets or not. And again, this is not to say one is more important than the other, but I just would like people to be aware of that perspective as well, because I think it is an important one. So, and perhaps just to answer the question from Martin, so far we've been using prevalence surveys primarily for active TB disease. Whether we would like to change that at some point, you know, then we would also need to adapt targets for the NTB strategy. People need to consider these issues as well, because really prevalence surveys have been one of our most important tools to providing robust, nationally representative data for TB burden. Over.
So maybe, Helen, would you like to respond to one of these points? You are muted.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, trying to unmute. Yeah, so, you know, and so Babis, you know, I very much, I hear you. But I think the thing is that we all know that molecular tests are the future and culture is the past. And so, yes, to compare with surveys that have been done with culture makes it very difficult for us right now. But I also think we have to look to the future. And I also think there's the issue of reproducibility. I do not believe that doing culture-based surveys are that reproducible, because we all know of these vagaries with culture, whereas I do believe that molecular tests are more reproducible. And so I think we have to really also think about the future. And it may be that we have to have some transition period for prevalence surveys when we do a bit of both, but then the next round, we just take the molecular side and compare to the previous molecular. But we can't keep saying we have to do cultures on tens of thousands of people, because it's just not sustainable, in my view. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. No, and I think one of the important things is maybe also to look more, as we saw from the slides from Evelyn, is that if you look at expert positive is not only positive, there's a lot of gradings in there. And I think we really need to look into that factor as well and see how we can come up with better protocols of using the data that we have and understanding which samples should go for which kind of diagnostics. I see a question coming from someone who is asking Kathleen whether she feels like there's another diagnostic that could be better than what we have now.
So one of the things that's coming out with Cepheid is the host 3 signature assay. And that might be something that would help us because it's looking at early disease, and it's looking at host signatures, host signs, not just bacilli. So if you used an expert ultra and you get a low or a trace, and then you use the host sign, you could look at that the likelihood of that person actually having active disease. So in those two in combination, maybe something in the future, because that's a rapid test that you can also do on top of a positive expert. But for, and I know that they're using, the other thing in that one presentation was the use of MBLA, and some people are considering using that, but we don't have it. That's still something that has to be done in the lab. So the sample will have to go through all the transportation and everything. But to be able to have somebody build that a rapid system for that might be something to consider. Those are the choices I see alternative to performing culture at this time.
Okay, yeah, thanks. We only have 5 minutes remaining. I do see something about the follow-up of participants, as we know that that's really important, as we can debate about culture and expert of who's giving us the right answer. How much work can be done on follow-up of participants in such a survey? And I know that's a real challenge and it's a lot of cost, but maybe, I don't know, Helen or anyone else would like to respond to that, as we did something in tweets already for that.
Yeah, thanks, Petra. I mean, just to say that in the treats prevalence survey, because we're doing research and so we have these opportunities, we have gone back to everybody who was identified as being sputum eligible because they had an abnormal chest X-ray or symptoms, whether they were diagnosed with TB or not, following them up to see whether they had, managed to start treatment, and then also repeating the chest X-ray and repeating the screening to try and identify how many people were missed by that just once-off screen. And I mean, we're still in the middle of analysing that, but hopefully for next year's conference we can present some very interesting data on that. But just to say, we do know that, some of those individuals, of course, on the day when you have seen them, they haven't been diagnosed with TB, and we refer them obviously for care through the system. But some of them, when you go back, the chest X-ray is still abnormal, and then their sputum has become positive, and of course vice versa. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Helen, and I would like to thank all the speakers and the participants for this very interesting discussion. And I think we will gonna bring all the questions together, and we will ensure that the questions will be answered. And I hope that by next year we will have another discussion. Hopefully we have already been able to set a little bit more clearly of what the protocol should be, as we know that that's really important. Yes, I think we have only like 1 minute remaining, so I think we're gonna close down this nice session. Thanks again, and back to whatever. Thanks, bye.